Hello, you fine people. So, once again, I have here Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche and another passage that I will be getting into. This one is the chapter called Before Sunrise. And as usual, I'm just going to read the passage and then I'll give kind of some comments on the passage. So, here it is. O heaven above me, thou pure, thou deep heaven, thou abyss of light, gazing on thee, I tremble with divine desires. Up to thy height to toss myself, that is my depth. In thy purity to hide myself, that is mine innocence. The God veileth his beauty, thus hidest thou thy stars. Thou speakest not, thus proclaimest thou thy wisdom unto me. Mute o'er the raging sea hast thou risen for me today. Thy love and thy modesty make a revelation unto my raging soul. In that thou camest unto me beautiful, veiled in thy beauty, and that thou spakest unto me mutely, obvious in thy wisdom. Oh, how could I fail to divine all the modesty of thy soul? Before the sun didst thou come unto me, the lonesomest one. We have been friends from the beginning. To us are grief, gruesomeness, and ground common. Even the sun is common to us. We do not speak to each other, but we know too much. We keep silent to each other. We smile our knowledge to each other. Art thou not the light of my fire? Hast thou not the sister soul of mine insight? Together did we learn everything. Together did we learn to ascend beyond ourselves to ourselves, and to smile uncloudedly. Uncloudedly to smile down out of luminous eyes and out of miles of distance, when under us constraint and purpose and guilt steam like rain. And wandered I alone? For what did my soul hunger by night in labyrinthine paths? And climbed I mountains? Whom did I ever seek, if not thee, upon mountains? And all my wandering and mountain climbing, a necessity was it merely, and a makeshift of the unhandy one. To fly only wanteth mine entire will, to fly into thee. And what have I hated more than passing clouds, and whatever tainteth thee? And mine own hatred have I even hated, because it tainted thee. The passing clouds I detest, those stealthy cats of prey. They take from thee and me what is common to us, the vast, unbounded yea and amen saying. These mediators and mixers we detest, the passing clouds, those half and half ones that have neither learned to bless nor to curse from the heart. Rather will I sit in a tub under a closed heaven, rather will I sit in the abyss without heaven, than see thee, thou luminous heaven, tainted with passing clouds. And oft have I longed to pin them fast with the jagged gold wires of lightning, that I might, like the thunder, beat the drum upon their kettle bellies. An angry drummer, because they rob me of thy yea and amen, thou heaven above me, thou pure, thou luminous heaven, thou abyss of light, because they rob me, rob thee of my yea and amen. For rather will I have noise and thunders and tempest blasts than this discreet, doubting cat repose. And also amongst men do I hate most of all the soft treaders and half ones, and the doubting, hesitating, passing clouds. And he who cannot bless shall learn to curse. This clear teaching dropped unto me from the clear heaven. This star standeth in my heaven, even in dark nights. I, however, am a blesser and a yea-sayer. If thou be but around me, thou pure, thou luminous heaven, thou abyss of light, into all abysses do I then carry my beneficent yea-saying. A blesser have I become, and a yea-sayer, and therefore strove I long, and was a striver, that I might one day get my hands free for blessing. This, however, is my blessing, to stand above everything as its own heaven, its round roof, its azure bell and eternal security. And blessed is he who thus blesseth. For all things are baptized at the font of eternity, and beyond good and evil. Good and evil themselves, however, are but fugitive shadows and damp afflictions and passing clouds. Verily, it is a blessing and not a blasphemy, when I teach that above all things there standeth the heaven of chance, the heaven of innocence, the heaven of hazard, the heaven of wantonness. Of hazard, that is the oldest nobility in the world. That give I back to all things. I emancipated them from bondage on their purpose. This freedom and celestial serenity did I put like an azure bell above all things, when I taught that over them and through them no eternal will willeth. This wantonness and folly did I put in place of that will, when I taught that in everything there is one thing impossible, rationality. A little reason, to be sure, a germ of wisdom scattered from star to star. This leaven is mixed in all things. For the sake of folly, wisdom is mixed in all things. A little wisdom is indeed possible, but this blessed security have I found in all things, that they prefer to dance on the feet of chance. O heaven above me, thou pure, thou lofty heaven, this is now thy purity unto me, that there is no eternal reason spider and reason cobweb, that thou art to me a dancing floor for divine chances, that thou art to me a table of the gods for divine dice and dice players. But thou blushest? Have I spoken unspeakable things? Have I abused when I meant to bless thee? Or is it the shame of being two of us that maketh thee blush? Dost thou bid me go and be silent, because now day cometh? The world is deep, and deeper than e'er the day could read. Not everything may be uttered in presence of day, but day cometh, so let us part. O heaven above me, thou modest one, thou glowing one, O thou my happiness before sunrise, the day cometh, so let us part. Thus spake Zarathustra. So, I'm going to go ahead and go line by line, but obviously it's a pretty long passage. I'm going to skip some of the lines which I think are less essential or whose essence is captured in other lines. O heaven above me, thou pure, thou deep heaven, thou abyss of light, gazing on thee, I tremble with divine desires. So he's seeing this heavenly modality of being before him, and from this modality emerges within him a set of desires which seem to him to be divine. He's coming to face the divinity of the world and his own innate divinity, and his will essentially longs to merge with these interwoven divinities, to become one with them, and to bring their heavenly energy into the world. Up to thy height to toss myself, that is my depth. In thy purity to hide myself, that is mine innocence. So his deepest desire, his innermost self, is one that yearns for the height of this heavenly energy. This is a state of absolute purity, wherein he sets his eyes on the world with childlike, blissful innocence. That is mine innocence. The God veileth his beauty, thus hidest thou thy stars. Thou speakest not, thus proclaimest thou thy wisdom unto me. Mute over the raging sea hast thou risen for me today. Thy love and thy modesty make a revelation unto my raging soul. So this heavenly energy and beauty are such that they're often concealed from the perceivers, from the human being. But when a proper state of spiritual or creative alignment is reached, this heavenly force kind of pours out in the form of a divine silence. And he elaborates on this divine silence in some lines that follow. We do not speak to each other because we know too much. We keep silent to each other. We smile our knowledge to each other. Art thou not the light of my fire? Hast thou not the sister soul of mine insight? So the silence of which he's speaking indicates a pre-linguistic modality of perception, wherein he's achieving a state of communion with the world, as if there was this sort of mutual understanding between the two, between the microcosmic consciousness which he is, and the macrocosmic consciousness with which he's interacting, whether it's an actual consciousness or just like a literary consciousness that he's projecting into these words. In any case, it's a personified, he's personifying this heaven above me that he's speaking of. And on top of that, this microcosmic consciousness and the macrocosmic consciousness, they understand each other in the profundity of a smile. And he recognizes within this reflective smile a sort of kinship with this heavenly energy, as though the energy itself were the sister of his soul. Together did we learn everything. Together did we learn to ascend beyond ourselves to ourselves and to smile uncloudedly. Uncloudedly to smile down out of luminous eyes and out of miles of distance, when under us constraint and purpose and guilt steam like rain. So like two siblings, they've kind of grown into this heightened modality of perception together. And by merging themselves into this unison of sorts of growing together, they become most authentically self-actualized, or at least Nietzsche is becoming most authentically self-actualized. And his eyes, reflecting those of his sister soul, become luminous with this heavenly energy, as if his eyes were like shining the light of this heavenly energy around him. And they project such energy into reality. And it's in this energetic modality of being that limitations or uncertainty or any kind of shame with being human recedes and just rises away like vapors in the sky. And I have a particular image in my head of, on a rainy day, when you're in one of those forests, like with pines and Douglas firs and redwoods, and you see kind of the steam rising into the clouds. That's just like the most beautiful image, and I think that's a perfect symbol of what he's talking about here. These limitations and everything, they just recede, and you dwell in the beauty of the consciousness of that image and that symbol. And wandered I alone, for what did my soul hunger by night and in labyrinthine paths? And climbed I mountains, whom did I ever seek, if not thee, upon mountains? So once again, we're seeing this archetype of mountains that are being associated with this more divine, heavenly modality of perception or energy or whatever you want to call it. And what have I hated more than passing clouds, and whatever tainteth thee? And mine own hatred have I even hated, because it tainted thee. So what a shame it is that somehow our defilements and those of the world come to cloud the beauty of this innate heavenly divinity. Not only do these defilements cloud our vision of this heavenly energy, but they might even begin to infect the very purity of that energy when we choose to project such flawed vision into this innate perfection. And that's a very real danger that Nietzsche worries about. Rather will I sit in a tub under a closed heaven. Rather will I sit in the abyss without heaven than see thee, thou luminous heaven, tainted with passing clouds. So Nietzsche recognizes that there's a kind of blasphemy in such behavior and projection. He would prefer to be banished to a world free of this heavenly modality of being, of this heavenly energy, than to allow himself, or anyone else for that matter, to infect it with defilement and imperfection, with kind of the behavior of vice or something like that. And he who cannot bless shall learn to curse. This clear teaching dropped unto me from the clear heaven. This star standeth in my heaven, even in dark nights. So essentially here, if you're living in the world in a way that is severed from this modality of being, where instead of aligning yourself with such a modality, pursuing this higher state, you follow the impulses of defilements and vice, inevitably your behavior, your willed volition, will begin to infect the world instead of blessing it with this higher energetic alignment. Instead of aligning yourself with the higher energy and bringing that into the world, you're aligning yourself with the lower energies and bringing that into the world. And then he says, I, however, am a blesser and a yeasayer. If thou be but around me, thou pure, thou luminous heaven, thou abyss of light, into all abysses do I then carry my beneficent yea-saying. So here Nietzsche is essentially just affirming his intention to align himself with this heavenly purity and to bless the world with its energy and wisdom. And so long as that energy is there, then that intention is to be carried out. This, however, is my blessing, to stand above everything as its own heaven, its round roof, its azure bell, and eternal security. And blessed is he who thus blesseth. So much as throughout the chapter he's talking about this heaven above him, which would be a sort of macrocosmic structure of this divine energy, he's now referring to his blessing the world as his becoming the microcosmic embodiment of this macro structure. So by embodying and absorbing this kind of heavenly energy, he's literally becoming a microcosm of the macrocosm. That's to say, he's becoming a smaller embodiment of the same kind of macrocosmic pattern that he sees in the world. And just like the sky is treating him in a certain way, he begins to treat the world in a certain way and pouring that energy in such a way where the sky is blessing him with this energy, so he then blesses the ground with that energy. Something along those lines. And now we get to a passage which required some deeper thought. It was very conflicting for me. And so it's got a few lines, but I'm going to go ahead and get into it. But I'm going to go a little deeper on this one. Verily, it is a blessing and not a blasphemy when I teach that above all things there standeth the heaven of chance, the heaven of innocence, of hazard, of wantonness. Of hazard, that is the oldest nobility in the world. That gave I back to all things. I emancipated them from bondage under purpose. This freedom and celestial serenity did I put like an azure bell above all things, when I taught that over them and through them no eternal will willeth. This wantonness and folly did I put in place of that will, when I taught that in everything there is one thing impossible, rationality. So here he's saying something which, from the Christian perspective at least, would certainly be considered blasphemy against God. And that's not to say I'm like a Christian or anything. I'm also not a Christian. I'm pretty undecided about the thing, but just that's definitely something we need to consider as we're reading this. But he specifically notes that what he's saying is not blasphemy, rather a form of praise and blessing. And this praise or blessing is one that defines this heavenly energy in association with chance, with innocence, hazard, and wantonness. So, if you ask me, these would all be kind of emanations of a force akin to chaos, if we're kind of making the comparison between chaos and order. where this idea might begin to resemble the more post-Enlightenment, scientifically materialistic view of the universe as this vast network of basically just cold, empty, nihilistic, pure probability and chance. And essentially, it's just a cruel, empty universe. It doesn't really care about individuals. So he emphasizes this hazard as the oldest nobility in the world. So he's saying that from this chaotic state of danger, we've learned to become noble and to create greatness, to transmute our suffering into accomplishment and meaning. So it's not a blasphemy to kind of worship that as heavenly energy. It's more so recognizing the greatness that has come from that. So there kind of arises this seemingly metaphysical implication, echoing once more this materialistic sentiment that this chaos would be a kind of primordial ooze out of which our freedom and even our divine potential emerged. So instead of God giving that to us, it would be the opposite of God, which would kind of be chaos. And he then goes further, and this is where it gets quite polemical. He says, when I taught that over them and through them no eternal will willeth, this wantonness and folly did I put in place of that will. When I taught that in everything there is one thing impossible, rationality. So here he's essentially defining and sanctifying even this force of chaos against the Logos itself, against God. And I guess not even against God, but just against any kind of ordering principle which might stand in accordance with some higher instantiation of reason. So not necessarily God himself, but I guess the Logos is a good enough term. But I think it's very much against God. Nietzsche had some beef with God for sure. So there is some kind of irony, or at least it's very interesting, because he makes sure to say that this teaching is not blasphemy, but a blessing. So obviously he knows this. This is like actual blasphemy that he's bringing forward, and blasphemy in its purest form, really. But the way that this blasphemy becomes a blessing for Nietzsche is that it releases humans and humanity from the chains of old commandments and demands of a God which, to his eyes, only aims to limit humanity in our endeavors. And with these chains lifted, we as humans have a newfound capacity to seek divinity more freely within ourselves and within this world, and to bring such divinity into existence, not because we're forced to do so, but in accordance with our will. It's not by the force of some God that we're afraid of, by the fear of punishment. It's of our own volition that we bring this divinity into the world. So I knew I was conflicted about this passage when I read it, but I didn't know how truly conflicted I am. So I kind of dug a little deeper into it. And to me, it kind of seems like there are three essential possibilities. Probably more, but I've reduced it down to three for now. The first would be, I guess, the simplest, and that would be that this is like literally a Luciferian message of revolt against God, as in it's satanic. Which, if Christianity is indeed the one true religion, which I'm uncertain about and pretty dubious about too, then this is pure blasphemy and deception. We should stay away from the book. And maybe Nietzsche is channeling some demonic message, which would sound good on the surface, but conceal a darker reality below. So keeping this in mind, he's also, or we might keep in mind that he's writing this before sunrise, so in the darkness. So this is there's a message that's literally being channeled from the darkness before the light of the sun, the light of God, might be coming into the world. Now, the second possibility would be that this is rather a message of revolt against God, but not against God himself, but rather against humanity's perversion and corruption of the concept of God. And perhaps even more deeply, a message of revolt against a false god, which might very well resemble something like the Gnostic demiurge, or in other words, Satan, because the demiurge and Satan are essentially the same force. So the implication here would be that if such a satanic demiurge can be said to exist, again, not affirming nor denying, then that force would have had its hands in the Christian as much as any other religion. And Nietzsche's longing for divinity and freedom in this world would be a response to the suppression of such divinity and freedom imposed upon us by this demiurge. More specifically, the demiurge would aim to impose its order upon our wills in order to prevent us from actualizing our own innate divine potential, because it probably feeds upon that innate and divine potential by misguiding it. So that's the second possibility. Now the third possibility is kind of between the two, and of course there are probably other possibilities, but this one's somewhere between these two. When we consider that God and the demiurge and Satan and all these kind of very profound symbols, symbolic characters, all of these we must consider archetypally. So perhaps Nietzsche is wrestling with these archetypal forces within his words and his psyche, or rather, maybe these archetypal forces themselves, these archetypes themselves, are wrestling one another within him through his words. Nevertheless, he's looking at the world in a state of bondage, wherein human freedom is limited in the amount of limitless potential it can actualize, be it by a metaphysical entity like God, or by the humans who have used the concept of God to establish a particular world order. Whatever the case may be, this freedom has been suppressed, and Nietzsche is all about freedom. And he basically sees beyond the confines of either of these worlds, and he imagines a world of total human liberation and freedom, where we might bask in the light of this heavenly energy that he's speaking of. And another kind of parallel that I see is I was reading The Birth of Tragedy recently, and we might make these archetypal forces akin to the Apollonian and Dionysian energies that he's talking about. The Apollonian would be kind of the dreaming mind that's caught up in the dream of, in the veil of Maya, so to speak. He makes that comparison. And then the Dionysian would be more dancing with the veil of Maya fluttering in the wind, where the veil has been lifted and we see reality in this more interconnected way. So that's kind of linked up with these archetypal forces at war with one another that I'm speaking of. So these are just kind of possibilities to ponder, and I'm definitely oscillating very uncertainly between the three of them. One day I'll be like, oh, I guess Christ is the answer. The other day I'll be like, nope, demiurge, and maybe it's all just archetypes. So I don't know. They're all worth very much further consideration, and would require further reading into other fields, the respective fields that I mentioned. So I'm not drawing any conclusions. I'm just kind of suggesting the possibilities. So with that long digression, we'll go ahead and go back to the text. A little reason, to be sure, a germ of wisdom scattered from star to star. This leaven is mixed in all things. For the sake of folly, wisdom is mixed in all things. So while he's essentially defined this heavenly energy against rationality and logos and God, here he comes back to recognize that, of course, there remain hints of logos and reason scattered across the universe, perhaps even God within this world. In other words, it's undeniable that there is order within the chaos. And interestingly, he says, for the sake of folly, wisdom is mixed in all things. So this order exists in the universe to drive us towards madness. And I might refer to that madness as a divine madness. I don't really know. Maybe Nietzsche was divinely mad when he hugged that horse towards the end of his life. A little wisdom is indeed possible, but this blessed security have I found in all things, that they prefer to dance on the feet of chance. So once again, we're seeing that kind of Dionysian energy where they want to dance on the feet of chance. So this order clearly does exist, but we like to dance the dance of life on the edges of chance and chaos as they make their energies known throughout the universe. And we bring our own order to that world. O heaven above me, thou pure, thou lofty heaven, this is now thy purity unto me, that there is no eternal reason spider and reason cobweb. So this goes back to the conflict I mentioned earlier. This spider and cobweb could be God, but it could also just be the demiurge, or it could be its own archetype. In my view, the spider can be seen as the weaver of intricate webs, requiring great skill and some kind of divine order, but it might also be said that she weaves her web literally with the intent to capture her prey in order to consume them. That thou art to me a dancing floor for divine chances, that thou art to me a table of the gods for divine dice and dice players. So this heavenly energy is a floor of boundless, unpredictable potential, out of which he may dance his way into some kind of self-actualization. So this is a realm of endless possibility and freedom. And in that endless possibility, life has the potential to become great, a great divine game. And each of us is a player in each of their own lives. But thou blushest. Have I spoken unspeakable things? Have I abused when I meant to bless thee? So here he questions if perhaps, after all, he has been blasphemous, if he has not gone too far in his metaphysical assumptions or polemical language. He essentially reiterates that his intention was to bring blessing, while recognizing that perhaps these very blessings may unintentionally lead to a kind of harm. At the same time, he calls this heavenly energy complicit in the act, for in the end, it's through this heavenly inspiration that he brought these blessings into the world. This heavenly energy was pouring into him, and then through him pouring into these words. So he's saying, oh, this isn't all my fault. It's the energies too. The world is deep, and deeper than ever the day could read. Not everything may be uttered in presence of day, but day cometh, so let us part. O heaven above me, thou modest one, thou glowing one, O thou my happiness before sunrise, the day cometh, so let us part. Thus spake Zarathustra. So once again, we go back to the title, and it's revealed that this heavenly energy was coming from the night sky before sunrise. And thus it might be implied that this is not only a dialogue with some energetic, heavenly, woo-woo state, but with the stars or the universe themselves. Interestingly, he's implying that this passage contains words that cannot continue in the daytime, that must remain in the night. Obviously, that might suggest that there's something dark, perhaps ominous, nefarious within the words, which would go along with one of our interpretations. This might, in fact, be pure blasphemy, and that I shouldn't be reading it. But rather than an ominous feel, I think of this from the perspective of a writer, in particular of a writer who's discussing such profound energies, kind of taking possession of them and merging with these energies. So Nietzsche was writing this in the Swiss Alps, and it's quite easy for me to imagine him writing these very words as the direct result of some profound, like meditative, almost maybe mystical experience. What I mean is, when I go into the mountains, that's when my writing becomes the most seamless, most lucid, and most kind of interwoven with my surroundings, where it feels like my soul is just pouring itself into words, and that the mountains themselves around me are pouring into my soul in the process. It's a very much macrocosmic, microcosmic process where we're kind of merging. And it's not to say that I'm like comparable to Nietzsche in any way, because he's a genius and I'm just like some writer. You know, I haven't done anything yet. I haven't accomplished the greatness that he has. But more so, I imagine him having this very sincere dialogue with himself and his surroundings in a pretty much unconscious state of musing, where he becomes the muse for his surroundings. And he's not really in control of the words so much as the words are in control of him. I think a lot of writers find this state in their writing. And then we have this transition between night and day, kind of suggesting a liminal state between dreaming and waking. So he might even be in like a hypnagogic dreaming mind or something. And that's the mind speaking rather than like himself. So if he's in this very deep unconscious state, there is the possibility that like some demonic energy is taking possession. It could also be God himself talking. I don't know. In any case, it's not just like conscious Nietzsche writing these words down. It's like there's something more going on, and that's Carl Jung's whole interpretation of this book. He's saying it's just a pouring in from the unconscious, and the unconscious chooses random individuals every now and then to pour these masterpieces of literature into the world in order to bring a message from the unconscious to humanity. So regardless of whether or not we take the Jungian framework seriously, in the end, this passage proves to be a dialogue between the infinite depths of Nietzsche's soul and the infinite vastness of a starry sky. And any human being who has stargazed for any good amount of time will know that between these two infinities, we can feel such energies that might be called heavenly or luminous or liberating, like Nietzsche does. But such energies also show they might be rooted in a force of profound, perhaps even ominous chaos. The words and their energy, they contain the fullness of that experience of being a human being, a finite human being with infinite depths and facing an infinite sky. And I think this whole passage embodies the full spectrum of existence, whether there is blasphemy or blessing in it. That's the point. It has both. And I think that since it has that full spectrum, we can definitely find some kind of truth and freedom within these words. So that's it. Hope you liked it. Have a good one.